Hey everybody, it's time to do a little more industrialization and imperialism here for World History with Mr. Lamond. Today we're going to focus on the imperialism part. So basically what happens is the Industrial Revolution takes place in the mid to late 1800s largely because of the Industrial Revolution. We're going to have a large change in the way countries have their foreign policies, and that's going to be called imperialism. And so let's start to break down, how did Europe win the race to imperialize Asia and Africa? What did it look like? Now, there's a really good crash course that you could use to preview this, or you could save it to the end to review this, but it does a good job of helping you with some terms and ideas that we're going to work through here. Now, in your outline, this might be a way that you might set this up: 3 Roman numerals, causes, types, and examples. And you could pause and kind of write that out, or just make sure you save some time as we go. The biggest part of it will probably be the 3 examples at the bottom. That's what you'll need the most space for. All right, so let's start to break down our causes of imperialism. Now let's define imperialism. Okay, that's a good way to think about it. When you look at this map, what stands out? You see color. What do you recognize for these colors? Well, these are places in the world that are controlled by, you can see here, European countries: Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, United States. And they do notice that there's a few independents here and there. But for the most part, what's happening to Africa and Asia and the South Seas as a result of imperialism? Well, it's being controlled by Europe. So maybe that's part of our definition of imperialism. It has to do with control. Well, why is Europe able to control Africa and Asia? Why not the other way around? Well, remember, technology is the key. And Europe has a head start on technology, and they've had a head start going all the way back to the Romans. Why did they get this head start? Well, remember, it always comes back down to food. The easier it is to obtain your food, the more of a surplus you can have. Surplus food allows people to do a different job repeatedly well, specialization. And so Europe was able to grow their technology the furthest and the fastest. And so when they show up in Africa, when they show up in Asia, they're able to have the imperialistic control. Now this, picture right here, what do we got going on here? If you look close, you'll see some mining tools. Looks like they're digging into the side of a cliff here. See some shovels and some things. Well, that means there must be something of value there, and the Europeans are there to get it out. They're able to use these people here, in this case these Africans, to help them with the work. But the key is they're pulling something from the land, natural resources. Of course, we're also going to want to talk a little bit about the impact. Here's a British officer having his feet manicured or pedicured or whatever that is by his Indian servants. Okay, this is going to be one of the ways we'll study how imperialism looks in these countries. But for now, let's talk about our causes. Okay, so again, from about 1850 to about 1914, the reason we say 1914 is the end date, is that's when World War I starts. The strong industrialized nations of Europe used imperialism to seize colonies and dominate the local governments and economies in Africa and Asia. Let's talk about some causes. First cause is nationalism. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, nationalism is pride in your country, and all these countries in Europe started to get a little too much pride. They started to get a little wealthy, mercantilism. They started to get a little powerful, grabbing colonies. And so they all began to see this almost as a race. The best countries have the biggest and most colonies. Remember what the British said: the sun never sets on the British Empire. They, total ego. Okay, I mean, this is, Tony Stark, Iron Man kind of stuff here. All right. In addition, the more colonies you have, the more power you have, and so it becomes a race. As you could see in that map we looked at earlier, they're racing to grab colonies. Well, there's also an economic competition. Now, this is what we talked about earlier because of the Industrial Revolution. Now, think of every factory that is opened, every industrial factory that is opened in Europe as like this, monstrous plant, like a little shop of horrors. Feed memories. And so it just wants more materials to go into the monster, into the factory, so that it can produce more goods. Well, Europe is a relatively small continent. And while it does have some natural resources, it's nothing like Africa. Look at a map of Africa or Asia compared to Europe. Look at the size. And a lot of Europe's resources have been picked over the last thousands of years. Well, Africa and Asia haven't been quite picked over as much. So they want to go there and get raw materials. But then, once you make all of those goods, and you have these finished goods, you want to sell them overseas. And so we talk about materials and markets, one of the causes for the age of imperialism. You want to go get the materials, make it into something, and sell it back in terms of markets. And Africa and Asia were perfect for both of them. Everyone was excited to sell stuff in China because there were so many people in China. Last but not least was this missionary spirit. Europe is a Christian continent, kind of in the midst of their Christian, the Reformation has really opened the eyes to many. And many of these European Christians wanted to civilize the heathens. They wanted to go to these places in Asia and Africa, which, they didn't have clean water and they didn't have hospitals and roads and schools. And they didn't have Christianity. They wanted to bring those things to them. There was something at the time period called social Darwinism. Darwin had been preaching that all life had evolved from small microscopic organisms, and that survival of the fittest concept that allowed for certain species and organisms and animals to remain while the weaker ones died out. Well, if you're a social Darwinist, you looked at Europe and said, well, Europe must be the fittest because they've won the race. They're the most evolved and superior race. And since they have won the race, it's their job, it's their responsibility to go to these behind, unevolved nations and help them move forward. It's racist, but at the same token, many of them did not necessarily believe that the Asians and the Africans could not evolve and move forward. It wasn't that they did not have the ability to gain this intelligence, it's just they hadn't gained it yet. And so the idea was, we're going to help move these people forward. And they referred to this as their white man's burden. It was their responsibility to go out and civilize the world, to take this new idea of all of these European, Christian, white man's ideas and take them into the world. Now, we talk about three types of imperialism. We talk about colonies, protectorates, and a sphere of influence. And each one deals with a little more control. So the most control is a colony. Okay, if a bigger country takes over a territory and controls it, you're their colony. We were British colonies. Okay, Virginia didn't make their own rules. I mean, we had some salutary neglect, but we were still under the king. Okay, and so colony is the most control. And most of what we're talking about, these places where Europe is going to grab and take on the map, they're going to be colonies. Okay. Second is a protectorate. A protectorate means we're going to let your government stay under control, but you're going to kind of be, for lack of a better term, you're going to be our little buddy. And we're going to tell you who to play with and who to hang out with, and you're not going to have your own independence. Now, your local government's going to be there, but we're going to be in charge. Okay? And basically what happens is you make a protectorate of something that you want to control so that nobody else controls it. In other words, I don't really want to take ownership of you. I just don't want anybody else to. Like, I don't want to date you, but you can't go out with anybody else. It's kind of a possessive boyfriend kind of a thing. All right, and then last but not least, you have a sphere of influence. Sphere of influence is when you don't control them in any way, but you won't let anybody else control them either, especially when it comes to trade. Basically what you're saying is, we get special trade rights within your borders, and no one else gets those special trade rights within your borders. China is going to be divided into spheres of influence. The world basically says, let's not fight over China. There's plenty of it to go around. You take a slice, I'll take a slice. You control trade. No one wanted to colonize China because they realized that wasn't going to happen. China's too big, too strong. It would be a difficult thing to colonize the whole nation. But they could set up spheres of influence. And I want to take you through some examples of imperialism and see if you can figure out which of the three causes they fit under. Is this nationalism? Is this economic competition? Or is this missionary spirit? Okay, so what do we got going on here? Looks like definitely some mining of some sort. So, open shaft mining in South Africa. Okay, so here's your economic reasons. You can also see some of the ideological. Notice the inferior way that the Africans are treated working in the mines. Okay, what do we see here? We see a school. See all the students? Okay, so this is definitely a white man's burden, missionary spirit. We're running up the flagpole. You're claiming land. Well, what is that? That's going to be nationalism. The excitement, the power, presence of their military. A little harder to see here, but you see what they're carrying? Fortunately for Dumbo, those are ivory tusks. So that's some of your raw materials, some of your economic competition. Very famous poem by Rudyard Kipling, the author of The Jungle Book, with the bare necessities. Excerpt from The White Man's Burden. Just look at some of the words there. Send forth the best you breed. There's some social Darwinism for you. To serve the captain's need. These new caught sullen peoples, these people are half devil, half child. And what are we going to do for these people? We're going to clean them up with pure soap. That's the white man's burden. Teach them to wash their hands. Okay, so that's definitely missionary spirit, white man's burden, social Darwinism kind of a thing. Here's some more of that. What's happening to China? Okay, they're dividing it. Notice they call them the heathen Chinese. Heathen, remember that word for not connected to Christianity? And notice everybody's showing up to take their slice, their sphere of influence. A little bit of nationalism here, a little bit of missionary spirit, economic competition. Everybody wanted a piece of China. First thought, you think those are the pyramids. Well, they're not. They're ground nuts, which I don't know what those are. I guess different than tree nuts, but it's definitely economic competition. They're trying to feed some industry somewhere. Another example, India, famous for their tea. East India Company was the English company, basically the Walmart of the 1800s that had the monopoly on tea. They're taking the tea straight from India and selling it back to them. Economic competition on a huge scale. And last but not least, two more, sorry. This is Cecil Rhodes, a British explorer who covered most of Africa and even took a slice for himself. For a while, there was a country in Africa called Rhodesia, named after this guy. He got his own country. Okay, that's pretty powerful. Okay, this is definitely your white man's burden, nationalistic imperialist. We're the biggest, we're the strongest. Look at him, he's literally standing on Africa, wearing, hunter's gear, like it's its own backyard. The opposite of it is the missionary David Livingstone, who gave his life bringing Christianity to Africa. A very impressive story about his entire adult life. He went in and around Africa, ended up dying from malaria, I believe, but of an African disease, buried in Zambia, right by the city of Livingstone by Victoria Falls. Very powerful story of the missionary spirit. And this is the Suez Canal. Literally, they built a ditch across Egypt so they could trade their goods. That is economic competition and nationalism. So you've got a good start to why imperialism exists and what it looks like. We'll get a little bit further with that as we look closer at Africa starting tomorrow.